designers can achieve big reductions in the embodied carbon in buildings. Amy Hattan, Thornton Tomasetti's Corporate Responsibility Officer, is talking with in-house experts about how they're reducing the effect of buildings on climate change. Here's how Embodied Carbon is a production of Thornton Tomasetti.
Hi, and welcome to episode 10 of Here's How Embodied Carbon. This series explores how engineers and designers can reduce embodied carbon, or the emissions associated with building materials, and minimize the negative impacts of buildings and other structures on climate change. I'm Amy Hattan, Corporate Responsibility Officer for Thornton Tomasetti, a multidisciplinary engineering and consulting firm. We've been focused on embodied carbon for over a decade and are channeling all of our capabilities to tackle climate change. I'm talking with colleagues about how they're achieving reductions in greenhouse gas emissions on their projects. Today, I'm talking with my colleague, Chris Williams, a structural engineer and vice president in our Portland, Maine office. Chris led the development of our embodied carbon specifications for timber, and he's going to tell us about some of the lessons he's learned through that process. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Amy. I really enjoy designing with mass timber, and it's even better when I know that using it lets me reduce the embodied carbon in my projects. But specifying for low embodied carbon when using timber can be a little tricky.
Tricky? That's surprising because I think of timber as a low carbon material. So let's talk about that.
When we think about ways to reduce embodied carbon in our structures, we can either work with traditional materials like concrete and steel and use basic design and specification strategies to reduce the embodied carbon. Or we can substitute those materials for something that is already lower in embodied carbon, and that's where timber comes in. Timber already has a lower global warming potential than traditional steel and concrete materials, and this is mostly because it takes less energy to source and fabricate it as a construction material. But there's an additional layer to timber, and that's called biogenic carbon storage. And this is a measure of the carbon that naturally gets sequestered by the trees in the forest. So when this structural material from the tree is placed in a building, that carbon that has been sequestered from the atmosphere can then be stored in that building for as long as the building is in service.
Wood is a very cool material. It's a living carbon sink, and it can keep that carbon stored even when the tree is chopped down and made into a mass timber building. Sounds like a pretty nifty solution to designing for lower embodied carbon. How do we capitalize on biogenic carbon?
So sometimes you'll see the two comparisons side by side. First will be the traditional A1 through A3 emissions from the life cycle assessment. And you might see another assessment after that that includes the benefits of biogenic carbon storage. This other assessment assumes several unknown parameters, and that's one of the reasons why biogenic carbon storage continues to be more theoretical at this point than something we can truly rely on. Assessing for biogenic carbon really relies heavily on sustainable forestry practices, and sustainable forestry is something of a black box. We need to know when the optimal time is to harvest the tree out of the forest. There are several other factors that influence storage efficiency, like the waste associated with debarking and limbing. If we are just taking that material out of the forest and not replacing it, we'll decrease our natural carbon sinks, add more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we'd be potentially doing more harm than good. So as part of the harvesting process, we need to ensure that there is reforestation. Mass cutting can also have other environmental and sociological impacts on the forests and the communities that they serve.
That's a lot of ecology and maybe even sociology that engineers would have to know in order to make the right choices. I don't think you took ecology classes in graduate school, did you?
I did not, and neither do most engineers. But fortunately, there are several certification programs out there that are informed by ecologists, and the gold standard for these is called the Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC.
Okay, that's promising. Tell us about the FSC.
Well, just a few days ago, I bought a wooden item from Home Depot for my son's train collection, and I noticed that both the train piece and the paper receipt that I used to purchase it had that FSC label on it. So if you haven't heard of FSC before, look around. It's actually very prevalent. They certified for us that supply material for a lot of the products that we use. FSC is a nonprofit organization that created a certification process to help forests become more sustainably managed. It uses several different measures of sustainable management, including the conservation of plant and animal species. It's a standard that we can look to for a mark of sustainable forestry and help us steer our designs toward certified timber for the benefits that it brings.
Learning about FSC is helpful, but going beyond this certification, what else should be in a specification for mass timber to further reduce embodied carbon?
So these are some of the lessons I learned from developing Thornton Tomasetti's embodied carbon specifications for mass timber. First, it's important to have a requirement for reporting the timber's global warming potential. Just like specifications for steel and concrete, it's good to require facility-level EPDs, which stands for Environmental Product Declarations. Now, these EPDs should not, in my opinion, account for biogenic carbon storage. And the reason for this is we really want an apples-to-apples comparison when we're looking at the other EPDs for steel and concrete, for example. We don't want a supplier to say, well, we can use biogenic carbon storage as a measure of sustainability for our timber products. We want a level playing field for the way that all the EPDs are reported. Also, while you want the spec to consider certification programs like FSC, there are other certification programs out there that may want to be considered. An example of these is a certification body called TEFC, the Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification. And it's similar to FSC. It was developed in Europe and tailored to their local forestry practices, and it has since expanded. It's important to note that, right now, there's no proven carbon benefit that can be tied to sustainable wood. So you can't specify FSC lumber and say that you're directly reducing carbon emissions. The research has simply not been done yet to prove that this is the case. But if you do decide to require FSC certified lumber, you certainly won't be doing any harm in that metric.
That's too bad. I got excited about the sustainable forestry certifications. Hopefully more information is coming that will drive more designers towards certified projects. Although I imagine using certifications as a solution is more complex than it sounds.
Yes, it is. Another thing to consider with sustainable forestry labels is what timber suppliers have to go through to get that certification. Sure, you'll know where they're sourcing their material from, but there tends to be either a limited supply chain or a cost increase for certified wood, or there could be both. So when you require certification, it may increase the cost of your project, and that needs to be evaluated. We also need to consider transportation emissions generated when sourcing the material. By requiring a sustainable forestry certification, you may indirectly add upstream emissions, also known as EE2 emissions from an LCA. And this may happen if the certified product comes from forests that are far away. So you need to really think about whether specifying the certification might do more harm than good, because you're adding in these additional transportation emissions to the overall life cycle assessment.
Any other considerations?
Well, I think the last thing to think about for any timber project is local supply chains. I live in Maine, which is a heavily forested state. So I look at what kind of products I can get from here and from the Northeast. And I try to compare these local products to other options that may be available. You really have to decide, does it make more sense to benefit the local industry and support local forestry practices that may have a low environmental impact, but don't necessarily have that sustainable forestry label? And you may be able to also reduce the E4 level of transportation emissions, which are the emissions associated with bringing the material to the construction site. Basically, don't be too limiting in your choices.
There appear to be several unknowns when using timber, but I just love the beauty and feeling of a mass timber building. And you make a good case that despite what we don't know, timber is a great choice for a low-carbon building.
So if you're planning to use timber to reduce embodied carbon in your project, do whatever you can to keep the timber in the project. What makes mass timber challenging right now is its high material costs and a limited supply chain. But the more timber that is used as a solution to our embodied carbon problem, the more the market for the timber will be able to expand, which will ultimately drive the cost down and make it a more affordable solution.
Hear to that. Love those timber buildings. Thank you, Chris, for illuminating a tricky topic. Folks, there's more. Follow Thornton Tomasetti for more episodes of Here's How Embodied Carbon.